The world had grown small, closing in to nothing but snow, ice, and the skeletal remains of day. Dr. Miles Carter stood on the frozen deck of the Halley 6 research station, watching a pale orange glow on the horizon shrink and vanish as the sun dipped below the Antarctic sky. Soon there would be only blackness, a darkness so absolute it felt like a warning. His breath fogged the air, catching the fading light before dissipating into the void. The cold was invasive, seeping through his thick layers, through his skin, and into his bones. The station was an unassuming bunker of gray metal and faint red lights blinking in rhythmic monotony, a last remaining echo of civilization in a place that wanted nothing to do with it. When he turned from the horizon, his gaze swept over the other members of the expedition, Dr. Elena Kurova and Ethan Grant. Their expressions betrayed no eagerness, only grim duty. The three of them had been hand-picked, each an expert in their own right. Dr. Kurova was a biologist, renowned for her pioneering work on extremophiles, organisms that thrived in conditions so hostile they bordered on the impossible. She had a look of icy resolve, her jaw clenched as she surveyed their new, unforgiving home. Beside her stood Ethan, their team leader and a seasoned veteran of polar expeditions. He looked as if he'd been carved from the ice itself, with eyes the color of slate and a face so weathered that it seemed immune to the cold. Carter couldn't tell if it was confidence or fear that made him so quiet. Their mission, one they'd discussed in hushed tones and cryptic reports, was to investigate an anomaly, a magnetic disturbance that pulsed erratically beneath the ice, so deep that none could say where or what it was. It had appeared 7 years before, only to vanish as suddenly as it had come. Now it was back, a beacon under the ice that no one could explain or predict. The reports that had filtered in from government sources were vague at best, hinting at classified data, strange electromagnetic readings, and rumors that even scientists as logical as Carter had found hard to ignore. They were to document it, measure it, and, under no circumstances, disturb it. Inside, the research station was cramped and claustrophobic. It hummed with the low, steady drone of machinery and the hiss of ventilation struggling to keep the air breathable. Each room was narrow, painted in sickly shades of green and gray, with fluorescent lights that cast elongated shadows. Every edge felt jagged, pressing in on them, and each sound, footsteps, a closing door, the scrape of a metal tool, reverberated through the station as though amplified by the oppressive silence outside. They spent their first evening unpacking, organizing equipment, and silently acknowledging the unspoken rule that each person had their own space and little patience for intrusion. Dr. Kurova spoke only in terse phrases, each syllable clipped as though conserving breath, conserving energy. Ethan moved with practiced calm, efficient and detached, treating each task like a ritual performed countless times before. Carter busied himself setting up his glaciology equipment, but his mind drifted again and again to the anomaly, that pulse beneath the ice, like a heartbeat thrumming just out of reach. Later, as night wrapped around the station, a strange, hollow sound echoed beneath them, a faint, rhythmic rumble, as if something immense and slow was shifting far below. It wasn't a mechanical sound, not the drone of the station, nor the groan of settling ice. It felt organic, like breathing, a sound that lingered in the subconscious long after it had faded. Carter paused, hands frozen over his notes, eyes fixed on the floor as he listened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, looking up at Dr. Kirova. She didn't answer, only gave him a sharp look, her face pale and set. She'd heard it too, and her expression confirmed what he had felt, that whatever was beneath them was alive, aware of them, listening. They retired to their bunks early that night, but sleep eluded them all. Carter lay still, staring at the ceiling of his narrow bunk, feeling the suffocating weight of the ice above and around him. The cold pressed down despite the heaters whirring around him, a deep and primordial chill that gnawed at his thoughts. He could feel his pulse, each beat slowing, mirroring the faint, distant rumble beneath him. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his mind, but in the darkness he could swear he heard something, a whisper, faint and low, rising from the depths. The next morning was a blur of routine tasks. They ate in silence, each of them lost in private thoughts, keeping their eyes down as though meeting each other's gaze might unlock something they weren't ready to face. Outside, the Antarctic storm had begun to build, thick gusts of snow battering against the windows, obscuring what little view they had. They were alone here, completely cut off, and the reality of their isolation began to weigh on Carter more with each passing hour. The hours passed with slow, cold deliberation. They spoke little, not out of impatience, but out of some shared, silent agreement. Every word felt heavy here. Words that might otherwise pass unnoticed in conversation took on a weight that was almost unbearable. As night fell again, that deep, hollow rumble returned, louder, closer. Carter was alone in the observation room, going over his notes when he heard it. A sound so profound, so alien, it felt like it vibrated through his very core. He could feel it in his bones, rattling his teeth, pressing against his lungs. It was rhythmic and slow, each beat echoing in his mind until it blended with his own pulse. He hit the record button on his handheld device and, in a shaking voice, whispered, "There's something here, and I can feel it watching us." The words hung in the air, absorbed by the cold, oppressive silence that swallowed the station. His voice was hoarse, as if his body itself was trying to reject the words, to push them back. But it was too late. The darkness had heard him, and deep beneath the ice something stirred, responding in kind. At that moment, Carter realized with bone-deep certainty that they had ventured somewhere they were never meant to be. Antarctica, the frozen heart of the Earth, was not just a place. It was a threshold, a border between known and unknown, between life and something far older, something alien. And they were all trapped here, watched by eyes that saw beyond time and reason. The whisper in his mind returned, clearer now, as though rising from a great depth. A single word, incomprehensible and heavy with unspeakable meaning, pulsed through his consciousness. Wait. The days bled into one another under the steel-gray sky, marked only by the unchanging hum of machinery and the subtle descent into paranoia that had begun to erode them all. Each day, Carter could feel the growing presence of the Anomaly, a silent, pounding force just beyond comprehension, like the pulse of a buried leviathan. He'd catch himself listening for it, half hypnotized by the steady beat that now seemed part of him, part of the frozen land beneath his feet. The readings started coming in stronger, each one more erratic than the last, oscillating between maddening spikes and sudden silences. Carter, Kirova, and Ethan pored over the data, but it made no sense, defying known physics, logic, even time. The signals didn't just shift, they seemed to respond. their frequencies changing slightly whenever one of them spoke or moved in the station, as if something below was listening, waiting for a cue. Dr. Kirova sat at her lab station, her face washed in the sterile glow of monitors as she analyzed the samples they'd drilled from near the Anomaly site. Her hands shook, her usually steady gaze flickering with something just short of terror as she traced lines in the readouts. "These cells," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "They don't belong to anything we know. They're organized, but not alive. Not in the way we understand it." She looked up at Carter, her eyes wide. "They mimic life, but their structure is wrong. It's like looking at a reflection that's almost human, but not quite." "What are you saying?" Carter asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "I'm saying that whatever is down there, it's older than we thought. It's..." She paused, searching for the right words, but they failed her. "It's watching us, Miles. I can feel it." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, the color drained from his face, his usually calm demeanor shaken. "I've been out here too many times," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've heard stories, but I never believed them. They used to say this place was cursed, that there were things in the ice that should never have been disturbed. That's why the Anomaly has been kept under wraps all these years. It's not a scientific expedition. Not really." He looked at them both, the shadow of fear darkening his gaze. "It's a warning." That night, the cold seemed to seep into the walls, pressing in on them, as if the very air inside the station had thickened. Carter awoke to find his breath clouding in the dark, a chill more penetrating than anything he'd felt on the surface. From beneath his bunk, he heard it again, that low, rhythmic rumble that resonated with the faintest echoes of something familiar, something he couldn't place. It wasn't a sound so much as a presence, filling every dark corner of the station, every silence in his mind. He found Dr. Kirova awake as well, standing by the observation deck, her eyes fixed on the icy wasteland beyond. She didn't look at him, her gaze locked on something in the distance, a faint, shifting shape moving through the snow, just on the edge of sight. It was massive and slow, yet fluid, seeming to move in impossible, unnatural ways that defied everything he knew about biology. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving only swirling snow in its wake. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," he replied, but the word caught in his throat. They said nothing more. What could they say? They'd both seen something that shouldn't have existed, a shape that lingered in the mind, a sight that their eyes struggled to recall but could never forget. That night, Kirova's eyes grew red and distant, and she stopped meeting his gaze altogether. In the following days, the Anomaly's presence grew stronger. The magnetic readings spiked every few hours now, the pulses breaking into irregular patterns that bordered on the rhythmic. The station lights flickered, sometimes shutting off completely for minutes at a time, plunging them into a darkness that felt like an extension of the Anomaly itself. The hum of machinery became erratic, sputtering and whining, as though the station itself was groaning under the strain. Then, as if drawn by some insidious curiosity, they decided to record the pulses, hoping that maybe capturing it would help them understand it. They set up the equipment in silence, each of them uneasy but unable to resist the pull of discovery. As soon as they started, the station lights went dark, leaving them bathed in the dim, ghostly glow of their monitors. The recorded pulses were disorienting, almost hypnotic. They seemed to weave in and out of each other, forming complex patterns that shifted and morphed, sounding almost like words in a language they couldn't quite understand. Ethan's hand hovered over the controls, his face pale in the screen's glow. "Turn it off," he muttered, his voice rough. It's like it's getting louder." But Kirova, her face set and unblinking, shook her head. "Listen. Just listen." The sounds grew louder, evolving, blending into a distorted chorus that resonated through the walls, through their very bones. It felt like it was inside them, each beat in perfect time with their own heartbeats, as if syncing them to something ancient and unimaginable. When they stopped the recording, the silence that followed was even worse. It was like the entire station was holding its breath, waiting, anticipating something they couldn't name. That night, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the Anomaly, but by something else, something out in the snow, watching with a gaze that was neither kind nor cruel, but curious. He went to the observation deck, staring out into the darkness, hoping to see nothing. And that's when he noticed the shadows on the ice, shapes that twisted and shifted just out of reach of the dim light from the station's windows. Ethan joined him, his face drawn, his eyes bloodshot. He said nothing, only pointed toward the shadows. "They're watching us," Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I swear to God, they're watching us." From deep below, the pulsing grew louder. It was different this time, faster, more insistent, as if in response to their presence, to their awareness. The air in the station grew heavy, pressing down on them, filling their lungs with an oppressive weight. Carter wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move, couldn't look away from the shadows shifting beyond the glass. The next morning, Carter found Doctor. Kirova huddled in her lab, her face pale and gaunt. She'd been studying the latest samples under the microscope, and she looked up at him with an expression of quiet horror. "It's changing," she whispered. "The cells, they're adapting to us, learning us." She backed away from the microscope as if it held a poisonous secret. "It's like it's mimicking us, trying to understand what we are." "What does that mean?" Carter asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "It means," she replied, her voice a brittle whisper, "that whatever is down there, it's awake. It knows we're here and it's trying to connect with us." In the silence that followed, the pulsing grew louder, louder still, until it felt like the entire station was throbbing with the beat of something alive and malignant. Carter glanced at Ethan, whose face had gone a sickly shade of white, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "We should leave," Ethan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "We need to leave, now." But the idea was useless. They all knew it, felt it in their bones. Whatever was beneath the ice, whatever lay buried in that frozen abyss, had already marked them. And even if they left, even if they ran, it wouldn't matter. The pulsing, the shadows, the whispers, they were inescapable, a darkness that would follow them, waiting for the moment they'd finally let it in. As they turned back toward the dim, claustrophobic corridors of the station, Carter felt the first taste of real, irreversible dread settle in his mind. Something old, something beyond understanding, had opened its eyes, and they were now helpless pawns in its gaze. With a shudder, he realized that this place, this icy wasteland, was no longer simply a remote outpost at the edge of the world. It was a prison, a snare, and they were caught inside it. The drilling began on a morning thick with silence, a silence that felt like the prelude to something dark. It was a stillness that wrapped around them, clinging to the skin like cold sweat as Carter, Kurova, and Ethan lowered the massive drill into the ice. They hadn't spoken much about this decision, each of them driven by a strange, feverish compulsion that bordered on obsession. It wasn't curiosity, it was closer to surrender. They'd come this far, and now they couldn't turn back, not with the presence of the anomaly pressing on them like the weight of a distant star, pulling them closer, deeper. The machinery whirred, cutting through layers of ancient ice with a low, guttural growl. Each grind of the drill against the frozen earth echoed through the station, filling every hollow room with a sound that reverberated in their bones. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of diesel and metal, the vibrations rattling their teeth, setting their nerves on edge. They were getting closer, and whatever waited for them below seemed to know it. Each passing hour heightened the tension. It was a grueling process, long, methodical, every inch of progress measured in precious minutes and brittle nerves. By the time they were near their target depth, all three were pale, their eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. Carter's hands trembled as he adjusted the controls, his heartbeat pulsing through his fingers in time with the rhythmic beats still emanating from the depths below. They'd all felt the pulses more strongly now, a beckoning that transcended sound and language, drilling into their minds, whispering with each beat. Come closer. Kurova's face was ashen, her eyes glassy, distant, as if the cold had seeped into her soul. She muttered to herself in Russian, words too faint for Carter to understand, her lips moving silently as she stared into the growing chasm below. Ethan had lost the glimmer of the experienced expedition leader. His face now wore the mask of a man gripped by fear and by something worse, anticipation. They were united by dread, bound by an invisible thread that grew tighter with each meter they drilled, drawing them closer to something they could neither name nor escape. When the drill finally broke through, there was no fanfare, only a sudden, unbearable silence. Carter leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness below. A cavernous void gaped beneath them, swallowing the light from their headlamps. It was massive, stretching out into the black with walls that shimmered with unnatural frost, like obsidian drenched in liquid night. Every instinct told him to turn away, to pull back, but he couldn't. None of them could. "We're going down," Carter whispered, the words heavy and final. They secured their gear and began the descent, rappelling into the abyss one by one, each swing of the rope bringing them deeper into the yawning chasm. As Carter lowered himself, he felt a strange resistance in the air, as though the atmosphere itself was thick, pressing against him with an unseen force. His breath fogged up, and the cold sank into him, colder than the surface, colder than anything he'd ever felt, a cold that seemed to radiate from something deeper, a frigid hatred that had been trapped, waiting. The walls of the cavern were slick and jagged, lined with symbols that pulsed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. They weren't carvings, they were organic, almost alive, shifting slightly under his gaze, as if they were trying to communicate something far beyond human comprehension. He ran his gloved fingers over them and shuddered. They were warm to the touch, pulsing in rhythm with the beat that seemed to echo through every cell in his body. By the time they reached the bottom, the darkness was absolute, thick as ink, pressing in on them from every side. Carter flicked on his flashlight, the thin beam cutting through the void. What he saw took his breath away. The cavern opened up into an enormous expanse, the floor stretching out like a frozen sea, dotted with towering structures made from a material that defied description. It looked like glass, but moved like liquid, shifting in waves of black and violet under the light, as though it was alive, breathing in unison with the beat of the Anomaly. These were no natural formations. They were arranged in twisted, unholy symmetry, spires and arches that seemed to defy physics, blending into one another with angles that hurt the eyes. "What is this?" Kirova's voice was a faint whisper, her words trembling as she stared into the darkness. "A city," Ethan replied, though he sounded as if he were in a trance. "A graveyard, maybe?" They moved deeper into the labyrinth of structures, their lights glancing off symbols that spiraled around the walls, wrapping around the pillars and stretching across the floor in intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift, never quite staying the same. Carter felt himself being drawn toward the center, as though guided by some invisible thread, each step heavier, the air thicker, charged with a silent, oppressive energy. It was Kirova who first heard the whispers, stopping in her tracks, her face pale as she strained to listen. The words were unintelligible, a language she didn't recognize, but their meaning was clear, resounding in her mind with dreadful clarity. "They're calling," she said, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "It's like they know us, like they're reaching into us, trying to understand what we are." The whispers grew louder, echoing through the cavern in a dissonant chorus that seemed to come from every shadow, every crevice. The sound wasn't just in their ears, it was inside them, threading through their thoughts, dredging up memories, fears, regrets. Carter staggered, feeling the words etch themselves into his mind, each syllable a wound, a violation. In the center of the cavern, they found it, a massive shape encased in ice, the source of the pulse, a thing that defied logic, form, and sanity. It was both solid and ethereal, shifting between shapes that Carter couldn't comprehend. It was as if it existed in multiple realities at once, bound in frozen layers, yet somehow aware. Ethan took a step back, his breath shallow, his voice a rasp. "It's looking at us," he said, though the thing had no eyes. It was a mass of black, writhing matter, flecked with something faintly luminous, like stars embedded in a pit of endless night. Carter felt it staring into him, into his mind, his memories, probing, searching, and then, without warning, it spoke. Not in words, but in an invasive presence, an awareness that poured into them, a torrent of images, memories, nightmares. Carter felt his vision blur, his mind folding under the weight of things he couldn't understand. Visions of worlds beyond sight, of civilizations torn apart, galaxies swallowed in darkness, all consumed by this nameless primordial hatred that lay entombed beneath the ice. The last vestiges of sanity slipped away as he realized the truth. This wasn't an anomaly, it was a prison, and they had been led here, not by chance, but by design. The thing in the ice was no mere creature, but a god, an ancient intelligence imprisoned by forces he couldn't begin to comprehend, bound beneath layers of ice and time. And as the realization washed over him, the entity stirred, its presence flooding his mind with a final, sickening clarity. It was asking for freedom, its rage and hunger reverberating through his thoughts, a hatred so intense it threatened to tear him apart. He stumbled back, clutching his head, gasping for breath. "Don't listen," he managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. "It's trying to get inside us." But it was too late. They had come too close, given it a doorway. The pulsing grew louder, faster, a frantic beat like a countdown. In that final, horrifying moment, Carter understood that the whispers weren't asking for release. They were demanding it. This thing wasn't trapped. It was waiting for someone foolish enough to hear its call, to breach the ice, to wake it from slumber. As the light faded and the shadows closed in, Carter realized that there was no escape. The thing in the ice was awake now, and they were part of it, woven into its consciousness like threads in a web. There was no leaving, no end, only a descent into an eternity of darkness, a final surrender to the abyss. The last thought he had before the darkness swallowed him was a single, hopeless whisper in his mind, the echo of a truth that had been waiting for eons. We were always meant to come here. The darkness had closed in completely, suffocating and thick, as though the ice itself had swallowed them whole. Carter blinked into the abyss, each shallow breath forcing air into his lungs against a weight he could not see. Beside him, Dr. Kirova was murmuring softly, her words broken and unintelligible, as though she was lost in a language she herself didn't understand. Ethan stood to his right, his face frozen in a grim mask of terror, staring ahead with eyes that had seen too much. They were bound now, no longer individuals, but extensions of the thing that pulsed and writhed beneath them, each heartbeat syncing with the dark rhythm of the entity entombed in the ice. The air was cold, colder than anything Carter had ever felt, a chill that gnawed into his marrow, sapping every last shred of warmth, of life, until only the bone-deep horror remained. In the oppressive silence, a faint whisper threaded into his mind, a voice not his own, low and mournful, yet filled with a boundless rage that transcended time. "You came here to understand," the voice echoed, each word a knife twisting in his mind. "And now you shall." The presence surged, filling Carter with visions that tore through him, images of an alien past and a forbidden history, stretching back to a time before humanity, before Earth. He saw worlds born and broken, civilizations consumed in darkness, entire galaxies swallowed by a void so complete it defied all sense, a hunger that transcended the limits of existence. The entity was ancient, a being not born of stars but of the space between them, a creature cast out from the boundaries of known reality, bound here as punishment, as exile. He saw flashes of what this entity had once been, a god, a creature of unimaginable power that had bent entire realities to its will, feasting on the energies of worlds, siphoning life from systems as effortlessly as a breeze, snuffing out a candle. But then, eons ago, it had been betrayed, torn from its dominion, cast into the icy tomb of Antarctica by beings beyond comprehension, left to rot in frozen silence, locked beneath the crushing weight of the ice. And now, after eons of silent fury, it had reached out, first faintly in pulses, then louder, until someone, something, would answer the call. Carter realized in a moment of sickening clarity that they had not been the first to stumble upon this prison. Fragments of memories, of other minds, flickered before him. Explorers, scientists, curious wanderers all pulled to this place, seduced by the mystery, by the irresistible allure of the unknown, only to vanish without a trace, each adding another layer to the entity's web of despair. And now they, too, had fallen into its trap. "You wanted knowledge, didn't you?" The voice seethed, dark and hollow, its tone mocking. "You wanted discovery. You call yourselves explorers, thinkers, seekers, but you are nothing but insects drawn to a light you do not understand, burning in the darkness. You came to find the truth, and now you are bound to it." Kirova let out a strangled gasp beside him, her eyes unfocused, her body swaying. Carter wanted to reach out to her, to ground her, but his own mind was unraveling, pulled apart thread by thread as the entity plundered his thoughts, dredging up fears and memories he'd long buried. He saw his childhood home, the faces of loved ones blurred and indistinct, memories warped and twisted, refracted through the lens of the thing's cold indifference. It was dissecting him, studying him, peeling back his soul layer by layer, searching for something he didn't know he had. Ethan had collapsed to his knees, his face a blank mask of terror, lips moving soundlessly as if in prayer, his eyes glazed and unseeing. The entity reached into him, pulled out his fears, his regrets, everything that had ever caused him pain or doubt, twisting them until Ethan was nothing more than a shell, hollowed out and empty, lost in the unending chasm of his own despair. Carter tried to scream, but no sound escaped him. His own body had betrayed him, frozen in place, his mind and soul the playthings of an entity so vast and powerful that his suffering was nothing more than an amusement, a fleeting distraction in its prison of ice. In its eyes, if one could call that boundless awareness, eyes, he was nothing more than a specimen, another in an endless line of curiosities. With an agonizing clarity, he understood that they were now part of it. They were not merely trapped. They had been absorbed, their identities merging into the collective despair of all who had come before them. They were fragments now, pieces in a mosaic of horror woven into the entity's consciousness, bound to its endless hatred, to its hunger for release. In the depths of his mind, Carter felt the entity probing, searching for something deeper, something that went beyond his life, beyond his memories. It was clawing into his very soul, reaching for the last shreds of his humanity, the essence that made him. And then, in that final moment of oblivion, he felt it, an understanding that was not his own, a revelation so vast and terrible that it eclipsed all thought, all hope. They were not alone in their suffering. This prison, this icy tomb, was a warning, a place cast away from the universe to contain a being that could destroy realities, not out of malice, but out of its sheer indifference to life. And now, with the seal weakened by their intrusion, the thing was reaching out again, sending its signal through the depths of space, calling to others, to other entities, other minds. They had opened the door, and it would not close again. "The universe will hear my voice once more." The words echoed through him, cold and final, like the tolling of a death knell. He saw, in that instant, the endless spiral of destruction that would follow, spreading from this frozen place, rippling outward across galaxies. And he knew that no one would be able to stop it, that this darkness, this consuming force, would not rest until everything was as cold and empty as it was. He felt himself slipping, fading into the depths, his thoughts blurring, his identity melting into the boundless hatred of the creature. Soon he would be nothing more than a whisper in its prison, another mind twisted, devoured, lost. With his last desperate gasp, he clutched for something, anything to hold on to, a final tether to his humanity. But the darkness pulled him under, filling every part of him until he was lost, his last thoughts swallowed by the cold, eternal void. In the final line of his log, written by a hand that no longer felt like his own, Carter scrawled his last words, a message, a warning to anyone who might come after, though he knew it was hopeless. The thing was awake now, and it would not rest. To those who find this, we sought knowledge in the dark and found despair. Leave this place to its cold, silent watch. Do not wake what waits beneath. As he set down the pen, the ice pressed in around him, the whispers fading into silence, the weight of the entity's gaze closing over his mind like a shroud. The last light blinked out in the station, swallowed by the unending night, leaving only darkness, endless and eternal, stretching out into the void.